All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 20, Between Europe and China, 1500 to 1750. Section 4, The Russian Empire, 1500 to 1725. So the modern Russian state really came out of the principality, or maybe ruling kingdom is a good way to describe it, Muscovy. So Muscovy was the ruling state centered in Moscow. And the Muscovy rulers came to power essentially when the Mongols retreated. And so Moscow served as a center of power in the particular region, kind of giving rise or giving some of the origins to the modern Russian state. One of the rulers, Ivan the Terrible, ruled from 1533 to 1584, expanded the borders of Muscovy. Muscovy and later on Russian rulers assumed the title of Tsar, which was, we'll say this is the title for Russian rulers. It derives from the term Caesar, similar to that of Kaiser in Germany, which was the title given to the emperor or given to the ruler. Tsar will serve as the title for Russian rulers. Sometimes you see it spelled Czar as well. Moscow itself was described as the third Rome. That is because Rome itself was the first Rome. Constantinople was the second Rome, that in the somewhere around the 400s CE, the Roman Empire transferred its capital from Rome to Constantinople, and then Moscow being the third Rome, because in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans and was renamed Istanbul. And this was very important in terms of religion because Christianity, maybe we'll write here, Christianity was in some ways kind of the common thread here. The Roman Empire was the first to introduce Christianity. Constantinople was a Christian city. That culture spread then to Moscow, but of course this got disrupted by the conquest of the Ottomans, whereas the Ottomans were primarily Muslims. The largest, or at one point the largest Christian church or cathedral, whatever you want to call it, the Hagia Sophia, was converted into a mosque. And so Moscow then, and especially the religious leaders there of Orthodox Christianity, really viewed Moscow as being the successor, the direct successor to the Roman Empire, and more importantly, the direct successor to the right version of Christianity. So that is Moscow as the third Rome. Following the rule of the Muscovy rulers, we could just say that generally speaking, the modern Russian state formed. A lot of that had to do with the incorporation of territory surrounding Muscovy, Siberia in particular. If we go to our map here, we can kind of get a little bit of a feel for where we're talking about. This map is a little bit odd in the way that it is laid out, and that's because it's primarily giving a bird's eye view. Here's Moscow, which again from the early 1500s and even into the 1400s continued to consolidate power and control in that particular region. Each of these is representing the extent of the Russian state by date. So the purple is the extent to which the Russians controlled by 1533. The brown was essentially what was incorporated by the year 1600, and the blue, which goes all the way out here, and also the green, which is showing you some of the interactions the Russians had into the New World here, are by the 1700s and eventually the 1800s. Siberia is the term used to describe, and maybe we'll use blue, this kind of area right here. Siberia roughly stretches, it's to the west and to the north Very sparsely populated, very cold, but also very valuable in terms of resources. In a lot of ways, when Russia continued to expand further and further, I guess that would be eastward, it was in a lot of ways like Russia's New World. There were indigenous people there who were not well equipped to fight against the Russian technology. Indigenous populations which were not or had not yet been exposed to diseases, some very isolated populations in that region. And it also brought a lot of valuable resources. So, for example, fur from Siberia brought the Russians a lot of money. In fact, even in Alaska, which is the actual New World, the Russians were primarily fur trading in that region, and it could bring back or yield a lot of money for the empire. Because it was also sparsely populated, the Russians also served Siberia as a penal colony. That is an area to send prisoners, oftentimes to perform labor. Not quite in this particular period, but especially later on, things like mining, also timber or lumber. Those are some valuable resources in that particular area. Now, in terms of Russian society, it is in some ways, society and politics, in some ways it's more similar to that of the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal Empire. It's a land-based empire with not a lot of sea activity going on, which expands and consolidates its control through the use of gunpowder weapons, but it's also different. And one of the biggest differences between Russia and the Mughals, the Safavids, and the Ottomans is religion. So whereas those empires were predominantly Islamic, the Russian Empire is primarily Orthodox Christianity. So Orthodox Christianity. We covered this in a previous chapter, but if you look at the Christian church, it's actually broken apart twice. One was what's known as the Great Schism, which broke up between Catholic, and Orthodox. And then the Protestant Reformation, which we talked about, which is the breaking apart of Catholic and Protestant versions of it. So in terms of Christianity, there's kind of three different categories we might describe. The Russians are Orthodox, right? So they're kind of in this much older version or tradition. Maybe, yeah, older is probably the right word. Most of Western Europe subscribes to Catholicism. This is Spain and France. And then, of course, because of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, the Netherlands, England, they're kind of in this version of Christianity here. So the break apart between the Orthodox Church and both the Catholic Church really is much earlier, happening approximately around the 1000s. Excuse me, not the 100s, the 1000s. This breakup occurring in the 1500s, right? So earlier there. The Russians often dealt with Cossacks. Cossacks were more of what we called, we'll say, your textbook uses this, steppe. Steppe is grassland. These were people who were more familiar with herding and horseback, especially. So if we go to our map here, Moscow itself is really located right up north here. Your Cossacks, and we'll get it in brown. Cossacks inhabit, this region right here, this region right here. And what makes the difference in that particular region, really stretching all the way across to Mongolia, is this is primarily grassland. And there were times in Russia's history where they went to war with the Cossacks. There were times where the Russians hired the Cossacks and incorporated them into their army. So it's kind of this back and forth relationship between a state and the Russians that is much more based in much less mobile, I might say. You can think of the Cossacks as being a little bit similar to the Mongols in that they were more nomadic, maybe in a sense. Now, the real beginnings of the Russian dynasty started with the Romanovs, beginning essentially what would be 400 years or 300 years of dynastic rule. And the Romanovs in consolidating control, so we'll call this Russia's most powerful nobility. Much of the time assuming the role of Tsar. Issued land grants to nobles, much like a lot of other states did. And also in terms of agricultural production, tied workers to their land. So serf, a serf is a worker, oftentimes agricultural, right? A farmer who is tied to their land. They're not quite slaves and they're not quite free workers either. They're kind of somewhere in between. In fact, serfs usually were assigned to work on a plot of land for any given landowner. And because their well-being relied on that landowner, they were really kind of stuck there. However, before 1649, serfs were able to essentially move from landowner to landowner once a year. In 1649, that law was overturned, essentially forcing serfs to be tied to their land indefinitely. And because serfs could no longer essentially freely move from lord to lord, lords could essentially treat them as slaves and treat them as really no repercussions because they couldn't legally move from their piece of land. So not quite the same thing as slavery, but certainly a labor system in which things were very tough, right? And a majority, this is the majority population in Russia. Most people are serfs. By far the most important ruler in expanding the borders and centralizing the Russian state, or the modern Russian state, was Peter the Great. Like many rulers, he had hereditary threats to his power. His half-sister, for example, was very ambitious. However, Peter the Great, who you see pictured right here, successfully essentially banished her to a monastery. Actually, let me go ahead and check that. Looks very suspicious. S-T-A-L-Y. S-T-E-R-Y. Okay, that's spelled correctly. A monastery, which is essentially a church building. Peter called for a new crusade against the Ottomans, right? So a crusade is a Christian Islamic war. So he went to war with the Ottomans frequently. His claim was to capture Istanbul. Remember, Constantinople was the second Rome. It was captured by Muslim rulers, the Ottomans, and Peter made frequent calls for new crusades, and this was a way to really garner support from all Christians within the Russian space. He was probably most well known for his European travels, so he traveled to Europe to learn. And really what Peter wanted to do to Russia was to modernize and westernize. This was a time period where Europe was, really starting to emerge in terms of its economy, in terms of its technology, in terms of its power. And what Peter wanted to do was, rather than to fight against Europeans, he wanted to embrace, copy, and mimic, to transform Russia to look a lot like France, to look like England, to look like a lot of these other states, which were really kind of, ascending, right? Copy the Dutch, et cetera, et cetera. In the Great Northern War, Peter the Great and Russia defeated Sweden. A lot of these states, or not states, or these kingdoms in the Nordic countries historically had more power than Russia. It really, what this war did was that it demanded that really other states respect Russia at this point. St. Petersburg was created as a new capital. It had easier access to Europe, which again is what Peter is trying to mimic. If we go back onto our map here, why don't we go ahead and use green for St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was right here. And so the idea was hopefully that, with the Baltic Sea, you can kind of get out here and get a little bit towards Europe a little bit easier, especially in terms of merchant activity. St. Petersburg itself was built to look like Europe. Here are some of the canals there, even down to the architecture of how buildings were designed. Peter also required that nobility shave their beards, and that was because Europeans shaved their beards. And rather than having a beard, which was considered by Peter and Russia as being like backwards, barbaric, that real civilized civilizations, like Europeans, shave their beards, and therefore Russians should too. In fact, there was a law against it, saying that if people didn't shave their beard, they could get trouble or get paid or forced to pay a tax or something like that. The decree of 1716 gave Peter the Great absolutist rule. So it essentially said that no law and no clergy is above the Tsar. Essentially what Peter did was he said that, look, not only is he the legal ruler, but he is also the religious leader. And so even though absolutist rule, absolutist rules certainly existed in a lot of other places around, this decree was only one further step for the Tsar, at least in the Russian state, to consolidate control not just over the population, but over the traditional nobility and over the Orthodox Church.